Pull up a map of the world, not a political map, not one of those color-coded things they hang in classrooms. A real map, a satellite image, the kind taken from orbit. Blue oceans, brown deserts, green forests. Now find Canada. You can't miss it. It sits across the entire top of the North American continent like a sleeping giant. 10 million square kilometers. 10 million. That's larger than the entire European Union. Larger than China. Larger than the United States by roughly 1 million square kilometers. Canada is so vast that if you drove from its easternmost tip, Cape Spear, Newfoundland, to its westernmost point, Mount St. Elias in Yukon, and you drove without stopping, without sleeping, holding steady at highway speed, it would take you roughly 72 hours straight. 3 full days just to cross one country. Now here's where things get strange. Zoom in on that map. Look at the cities, the dots of civilization, the places where people actually live. You'll notice something immediately, something that doesn't add up. Almost everything is in a thin strip along the bottom. 90% of Canada's entire population, every single person, every family, every city, every suburb, lives within 160 kilometers of the United States border. 160 kilometers, less than a 2-hour drive, in a country that stretches 4,600 kilometers from north to south. Everything above that thin ribbon? Almost nothing. Ghost land, wilderness so vast it doesn't even register on population density maps. Entire provinces, territories technically, where you could drive for 16 hours and never see another human being. Where communities are separated not by traffic jams, but by hundreds of kilometers of tundra, by rivers with no bridges, by forests so dense and so dark that even in summer they block the sun. Now, let me give you a number that will genuinely disturb you. 40 million. That's Canada's population. 40 million people. In the second largest country on Earth. Tokyo alone holds 37 million people. Just Tokyo. One city, in one corner of one island nation. The entire state of California, a place you could drive across in a single afternoon, holds 39 million people, almost as many as all of Canada. Canada has fewer people per square kilometer than the Sahara Desert. Let that land for a second. Now, here's the question everyone asks. Here's the answer everyone gives. And here's why that answer is completely wrong. It's cold. That's it. That's what most people say. Canada's cold. Nobody wants to live there. Mystery solved. Let's move on. Except Siberia is cold. Russia has 145 million people. A chunk of them live east of the Ural Mountains in conditions so brutal that your car engine will crack if you don't keep it running overnight. Siberia is cold in a way that makes Canadian winters feel like a mild inconvenience by comparison. And yet, there are cities there. Real cities with millions of people. Alaska is cold. Alaska is freezing, isolated, accessible mainly by plane, tucked up in the same Arctic latitudes as Canada's harshest regions. And people live there, voluntarily, without being forced. Iceland sits on a volcanic rock in the North Atlantic, battered by Arctic winds, dark for months at a time. Iceland is fine. Iceland has a booming economy, a tourism industry that's become almost uncomfortably popular, and a population that's growing. So cold is not the answer. Cold is part of the story. But the real story starts somewhere else, somewhere older, somewhere deeper than any explanation you've heard before. The real story starts 12,000 years ago, and it ends with a question so uncomfortable that most Canadians don't even ask it. Is Canada's emptiness a failure? Or is it the greatest accidental conservation project in human history? We're going to find out. But first, we need to go back, way back, to a time before Canada was Canada, before it was a country, before it was a colony, before it was even a name on a map. We need to go back to when it was just ice. But before we get there, let's make this visual for a moment. Pull up Google Maps, search Resolute, Canada. It's a community in Nunavut, on Cornwallis Island, in the high Arctic. Population, approximately 200 people. It is one of the northernmost permanently inhabited places on Earth. The nearest other community is hundreds of kilometers away. In winter, the sun does not rise for months. Temperatures routinely fall below -50 degrees Celsius, with wind chill. 200 people. Now search Midtown Manhattan, New York. Same map, same planet. That one neighborhood, just a few square kilometers, holds more than 70,000 people. The contrast is almost too large to comprehend, but it's real. And it is the geographical reality of Canada made visible in a single comparison. Now, let me ask you something. Why does this matter to you? Why should someone watching this video from Atlanta, or Denver, or Seattle, or Houston care about why Canada's north is empty? Here's why. Because Canada's emptiness and what fills that emptiness is going to be one of the defining geopolitical stories of the 21st century. As climate change reshapes where on Earth humans can live, as fresh water becomes the most contested resource on the planet, as new shipping routes open through what was once impenetrable Arctic ice, Canada moves from the periphery of world affairs to its center. And the reason Canada is geographically unprepared for that moment, the reason it has so few people, so little infrastructure, and so much gorgeous, untouched, strategically vital land, goes back 12,000 years. Let me show you how. The key to understanding Canada is understanding that it is not one country. It is 3 countries, stacked on top of each other, with almost nothing in common except a flag and a shared indifference to hockey jokes. There is southern Canada, the thin ribbon along the American border where 90% of Canadians live. Modern cities, decent infrastructure, 4 seasons of weather that are uncomfortable but survivable. This is the Canada of Tim Hortons and NHL hockey and politely apologizing for things you didn't do. This Canada is real and it is livable. There is Middle Canada, the boreal forest, the prairies, the Canadian Shield. Sparsely populated, resource-dependent, beautiful in summer, punishing in winter. This is the Canada of remote mining towns, of logging camps, of wheat farms that stretch so far you can't see where the field ends. Some people love it here. Most people don't stay. And then there is Northern Canada, the territories of Yukon, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut, bigger than most continents, population of roughly 115,000 people combined, less than a medium-sized American suburb, places where the laws of the country technically apply, but the reach of the state is paper-thin, where communities exist in a kind of parallel world connected to the southern economy mainly through expensive air links and the internet. To understand why Canada is empty, you need to understand all three. 20,000 years ago, Canada didn't exist. Not politically, obviously, but physically. The land that would one day become the second largest nation on Earth was buried. Completely, utterly, under ice. We're not talking about a heavy snowfall. We're not talking about a hard winter. We're talking about the Laurentide ice sheet, one of the largest and most powerful geological forces ever to reshape a continent. At its maximum extent, the Laurentide covered approximately 13 million square kilometers, blanketing everything east of the Rocky Mountains from the Arctic down into what is now the northern United States. In some places, the ice reached a thickness of more than 2 kilometers. 2 kilometers straight down. That's taller than most of the mountains you can see in the eastern half of North America. Now imagine something 2 kilometers tall, 13 million square kilometers wide, and made entirely of ice, pressing down on the Earth with a force so immense it literally pushed the bedrock into the mantle. That's what happened to Canada. And when ice does that, when it sits on top of a landmass for thousands upon thousands of years at that kind of pressure, it doesn't just sit there, it moves. Glaciers flow, slowly but inexorably, like rivers of frozen stone. And as they flow, they do something truly brutal to the land beneath them. They scrape. Think of it like the world's largest, slowest, most powerful sandpaper. The ice embedded rocks and boulders into its base, some of them enormous, the size of houses, and dragged them across the landscape for miles and miles. As it went, it stripped away the soil. Not just the topsoil, the deep soil, the rich accumulated biological material that takes thousands of years to build up, the stuff that feeds civilizations, the stuff that made the American Midwest the breadbasket of the world. The Laurentide scraped it all off. What it left behind looked like this: exposed bedrock, scoured smooth. Millions of lakes, carved by the ice itself, left behind as the glaciers finally retreated. And thin, acidic, nutrient-poor soil, the kind of soil that grows sparse boreal forests, not wheat fields. The ice finally began its long retreat around 12,000 years ago, as the planet gradually warmed. And what it revealed was a landscape of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hostility. This is the first and most fundamental reason Canada is empty. It's not politics. It's not culture. It's not a failure of governance or imagination. It's geology. The land itself was written off by the last ice age. But let's get specific, because the details matter. When the ice retreated, it left Canada with 3 distinct geographical problems. 3 geological strikes against it that compound and reinforce each other to create one of the most challenging environments for human civilization on the planet. Strike 1. The Canadian Shield. The shield is enormous. It covers roughly half of Canada's total land area, about 5 million square kilometers, stretching from the Arctic archipelago down through Quebec, Ontario, and into the northern edges of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. It is, in geological terms, one of the oldest pieces of exposed continental crust on Earth. Some of the rock formations here date back 3 billion years. Beautiful. Yes, absolutely stunning. If you've ever seen the Canadian Shield in summer, the endless lakes glittering under a pale blue sky, the dark green forests stretching to every horizon, the smooth granite rocks worn down to gentle curves by the glaciers. You understand why people have used the word cathedral to describe it. Usable? Almost entirely no. The shield is rock, ancient, impermeable rock with almost no soil. You cannot farm it. You cannot easily build on it. The lakes, and there are hundreds of thousands of them, are gorgeous, but they are also barriers. They fragment the landscape, make road construction hideously expensive, and isolate communities from each other. The Canadian Shield is the world's most beautiful dead end. Look at any population density map of Canada, and you'll see the shield effect immediately. The populated South, the corridor from Windsor to Quebec City, sits just below and west of the shield. The moment the shield begins, the dots of civilization stop, almost completely. Strike 2. The boreal forest, stretching in a vast band across Canada just south of the tundra. The boreal, or taiga, is one of the largest terrestrial ecosystems on the planet. It covers roughly 60% of Canada's land area. It is a world of black spruce and jack pine, of peat bogs and muskeg, that thick, waterlogged, half-decomposed layer of organic material that makes the ground feel like walking on a sponge and makes construction an engineering nightmare. The boreal is not a welcoming environment. The soil is thin and acidic. Trees grow slowly. The growing season is brutally short. In parts of northern Saskatchewan, you have around 80 frost-free days per year. 80. That's 2.5 months where you can actually grow food. The rest of the year, the ground is frozen. And then there are the insects. This might sound trivial, but ask anyone who's spent a summer in the Canadian boreal, and they will tell you, the insects are not trivial. The mosquitoes and black flies emerge in vast, almost incomprehensible clouds that make outdoor labor, real labor, the kind needed to clear land, build infrastructure, harvest crops, almost physically impossible for stretches of time. Early settlers wrote about this in terms that bordered on panic. Some described working under nets at all times, horses driven nearly mad by the biting insects. Work halted entirely during the worst weeks. Strike 3. The growing season problem. This is where the cold argument is right, just not in the way most people think. The issue isn't that Canada is simply cold. The issue is the combination of cold, latitude, and the specific way that affects what can be grown and where. Consider the numbers. In southern Ontario, the most temperate part of Canada outside of coastal British Columbia, you get roughly 150 to 180 frost-free days per year. That's enough for corn, soybeans, wheat. It's enough to support real agriculture. Drive 4 hours north, you're now in the Sudbury area. Frost-free days, around 110. Drive further north toward Timmins, around 80 days. The Northwest Territories, 60 days, sometimes 50. The high Arctic. You're not farming, period. Every 100 kilometers you move north in Canada, the agricultural window closes a little more. And because so much of Canada's landmass is at high latitudes, more so than Russia's population centers, more so than Scandinavia's, the zone where farming is even remotely viable is small, concentrated, and already fully occupied. Compare this to the American Midwest, the great agricultural belt of Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska, Kansas. This land sits at latitudes between 37 and 47 degrees north. It has 140 to 200 frost-free days per year. The soil is deep, dark, and incredibly fertile, the product of thousands of years of prairie grass decomposing and rebuilding itself without the devastation of a major ice sheet scraping everything away. A farmer in Kansas grows wheat at yields that would be almost physically impossible in central Saskatchewan. Not because of technology, because of geology. Because of where the Laurentide ice sheet stopped and where the Great Plains were left untouched. This is the great geographical unfairness at the heart of North America. The United States got the good land. Canada got the ice damage. Not entirely. Canada has excellent agricultural land in the southern prairies, in the Okanagan Valley, in southern Ontario, but proportionally, as a percentage of total land area, the difference is staggering. And here's where it gets truly interesting. Because before any European ever set foot on Canadian soil, before any of this geological analysis was even remotely possible, the people who actually lived on this land already understood it perfectly. The indigenous nations of Canada, the Haida, the Cree, the Inuit, the Ojibwe, the Haudenosaunee, the Blackfoot, and hundreds of others had been reading this landscape for at least 12,000 years. They knew which land could support large communities and which could not. They knew the rivers, the migration patterns, the berry harvests, the fish runs. And here's what their deep knowledge revealed. Even the people most perfectly adapted to this environment, people who had spent millennia learning to thrive here, lived at relatively low population densities. Not because they lacked sophistication. Their cultures were extraordinarily complex, their knowledge of the land profound, their social structures intricate and resilient. But the land had limits, hard limits, the kind baked into the bedrock by 3 billion years of geology and 12,000 years of ice. On the Pacific coast, where the ocean provided protein-rich salmon in massive seasonal runs, and the climate was milder, you had denser populations. The Haida of Haida Gwaii built large permanent villages and developed one of the most artistically sophisticated cultures on the continent. The Tlingit, the Tsimshian, these were peoples supported by genuine ecological abundance. But move inland, move into the boreal, move onto the shield. The population thinned dramatically because it had to, because the land demanded mobility over permanence. You couldn't have a city of 50,000 people in the northern boreal forest because there was no way to feed 50,000 people from the land around them. The environment was writing the rules, and it had been writing them for thousands of years before anyone thought to question them. Then, in the 1490s and early 1500s, the Europeans showed up, and instead of reading those rules, they decided to rewrite them. It did not go well. But before we get to that catastrophe, I need to tell you about the shield in winter, because the shield in winter, with its frozen lakes forming highways across the landscape, its boreal forests going silent and deep, is simultaneously the most beautiful and most lethal version of this geography. In January, temperatures across the Canadian Shield routinely fall to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. At those temperatures, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal becomes brittle. Diesel fuel gels. Engines that aren't running continuously can seize permanently. The ground is frozen to depths of several feet, making any construction or excavation impossible without specialized equipment. The lakes freeze, and this creates one of the strangest and most revealing features of northern Canada, the ice road. There are communities in Canada's north, populated communities, communities with schools and hospitals and hockey rinks that are accessible by road only when the lakes and rivers freeze solid enough to drive on. For the rest of the year, everything, food, medicine, fuel, construction materials, everything must be flown in by small aircraft at costs that make a head of lettuce worth $10 and a gallon of milk worth $15. This is not a marginal phenomenon. This affects tens of thousands of Canadians in the Northwest Territories, in Nunavut, in northern Manitoba, and Ontario. Communities so isolated that they live on a fundamentally different economic reality than the rest of the country. And if you want to understand why Canada's north remains largely empty, you need to spend a winter in one of these communities. You need to experience what it means to live in a place where the infrastructure of modern civilization, the roads, the utilities, the supply chains, fails in winter because the geography simply does not permit them to function. The shield, the boreal, the growing season, the ice roads. These are not complaints. They are facts. Geological facts, meteorological facts, ecological facts, laid down over millions of years and absolutely indifferent to human ambition. When the Europeans came to Canada, they brought enormous ambition. What the geography handed them was a reality check 12,000 years in the making. The question is, why did it take so long for anyone to admit they were losing? Let me tell you about the soil. This seems like a strange place to spend time. Soil. It doesn't have the dramatic sweep of ice ages or the visible violence of glacier carving. Soil is dirt. Boring, quiet, unglamorous dirt. But soil is civilization, quite literally. Every great civilization in human history has been built on good soil. The ancient Egyptians on the flood-deposited silt of the Nile Valley. Mesopotamia on the alluvial plains of the Tigris and Euphrates. The Roman Empire expanding outward from the fertile volcanic soils of the Italian peninsula. The great agricultural civilizations of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, dependent on the rich paddy soils that supported dense rice cultivation. Show me the soil, and I'll show you where civilization grows. Now let me show you Canada's soil. The most significant soil type across much of Canada is something called a spodosol, or, in the Canadian system, a podzol. It forms under coniferous forests in cool, moist climates. The process works like this. Acidic needles from spruce and pine trees fall to the ground, decompose, and create an acidic layer. Water filters through this layer, leaching nutrients, iron, aluminum, organic matter, downward and depositing them in a subsurface layer. The result is a soil profile that looks almost dramatic. A pale, almost bleached upper layer, called the alluvial horizon, sitting above a reddish or brownish illuvial layer where the leached material has accumulated. It looks impressive in a soil science textbook. It is almost completely useless for agriculture. Podzols are acidic, pH of 4 to 5.5. I compared to the neutral 7.0 preferred by most crops. They have very low organic matter content. They drain nutrients away rather than holding them. And crucially, they are thin. In many areas of the Canadian Shield, there isn't even enough soil to worry about its quality. There's just rock, with the thinnest scraping of organic material in the cracks and hollows. Compare this to a mollisol, the soil type that underlies the American Great Plains. Mollisols are grassland soils formed over thousands of years of prairie grass growing, dying, and decomposing. They are dark, almost black in the best examples because of their extraordinary organic matter content. They are deep, sometimes over a meter of rich, fertile topsoil. They hold nutrients. They hold moisture. They support plant life with a generosity that seems almost magical compared to the thin, acid soils of the boreal. When American pioneers described the Great Plains soil as black gold, they were not being metaphorical. That soil is worth more, in long-term economic terms, than all the oil in Oklahoma. It's the reason the American Midwest became the agricultural powerhouse of the world. Canada's prairie provinces have good soil. The black soils of southern Manitoba and Saskatchewan, Chernozems in the Canadian classification system, are legitimately excellent. They're the agricultural backbone of the country, and they produce wheat, canola, and other crops at high yields. But they represent a small fraction of Canada's total land area. And they sit in a narrow latitudinal band, roughly between 49 and 53 degrees north, below which the climate becomes more temperate and above which the growing season becomes too short for reliable crops. Canada's agricultural heartland is real, but it's bounded. It cannot be expanded northward by human will, because north of that band, the soil and the climate conspire against it. This is the geological sentence that Canada cannot appeal. Now let me add something that's rarely mentioned in these discussions: the muskeg. Muskeg is a word of Algonquian origin, meaning low-lying bog. It refers to a specific type of landscape, vast, flat, waterlogged areas of organic material that cover enormous swaths of northern Canada. Technically, muskeg is a form of bog or peatland, formed from thousands of years of partially decomposed sphagnum moss and other organic material that accumulates in poorly drained areas. Canada has approximately 1 million square kilometers of muskeg. 1 million. That's larger than France and Germany combined. Muskeg is extraordinarily difficult to build on. The ground is soft, waterlogged, compressible. Structures sink into it. Roads built across it require specialized engineering and constant maintenance. In summer, it's essentially impassable on foot. You sink to your knee with each step, sometimes deeper. It's breeding ground for billions of mosquitoes. It's uninhabitable in any practical sense, and it's beautiful in its way. If you've ever seen muskeg from the air on a clear summer day, the thousands of small lakes and ponds reflecting the sky, the dark green of the sphagnum moss, the occasional spruce tree growing improbably from what looks like a floating mat of organic material, you understand why people use the word haunting. It's a landscape that feels prehistoric, ancient, like the earth is still deciding what it wants to be in this corner. But you cannot farm it. You cannot build on it, not economically. And it covers a territory larger than the entire European Union. When we talk about why Canada is empty, we need to understand that it's not just that the north is cold and the soil is poor. The very physical composition of the landscape, the rock, the muskeg, the permafrost, the endless boreal swamp, creates conditions that make human civilization almost physically impossible at scale. It's not a matter of determination, or investment, or political will. The land itself says no, and has been saying it for 12,000 years. Here's where things get genuinely strange, because when the first Europeans began exploring what we now call Canada, the French, the Portuguese, the English, the Basques, they weren't thinking about settling. Not initially. They were thinking about something else entirely. They wanted China. Specifically, they wanted a faster way to get to China. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, the spice trade was the oil industry of its era. The riches of Asia, silk, spices, porcelain, were moving overland along routes that were slow, expensive, and controlled by intermediaries who took enormous cuts. European merchants and monarchs were desperate for a sea route, a shortcut that would let them bypass the middlemen and access the wealth of the East directly. Columbus, famously, went west and hit the Americas by accident. He thought he'd found Asia. He hadn't. But the idea of sailing west to reach the east, of finding a navigable passage through or around the top of the North American continent, gripped European explorers for the next several centuries. They called it the Northwest Passage, a theoretical maritime highway through the Arctic that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. John Cabot reached Newfoundland in 1497 looking for it. Jacques Cartier sailed up the St. Lawrence River in 1534, convinced it would lead him to China. Henry Hudson, in 1610, sailed into the massive bay that now bears his name, certain this was the Western Sea. His crew mutinied and left him to die in that bay. But the search continued. The Northwest Passage didn't exist. Not in any usable form. The Arctic ice made it impassable for centuries. It's only in recent decades, as climate change has melted the sea ice dramatically, that the passage has become navigable, a grim irony we'll return to. But while Europeans were busy looking for something that wasn't there, they found something else, something that would shape Canada's entire demographic destiny for the next 200 years. Beavers. The North American beaver, Castor canadensis, is a large, industrious, semi-aquatic rodent. It builds dams. It fells trees with its teeth. It is, in ecological terms, what biologists call a keystone species, an animal whose behavior reshapes its entire environment in ways that allow dozens of other species to thrive. And in the 1600s, beaver fur was worth more than gold. This requires some explanation, because from a modern perspective, it is genuinely baffling. In early modern Europe, felt hats were not a fashion choice. They were a status symbol, a class marker, a social declaration. And the best felt, the most durable, the most water-resistant, the most lustrous, was made from the underfur of the North American beaver. The guard hairs were stripped away. The soft underfur was matted into felt through a chemical and mechanical process, and the result was a material that held its shape, repelled rain, and lasted for decades. European beavers had been hunted to near extinction across the continent, but North America had beavers in numbers that were almost incomprehensible to European eyes, tens of millions of them ranging across virtually the entire continent. What followed was not a colonization in the agricultural sense, not the clearing of land. the building of towns, the establishment of farms and churches and schools. What followed was a commercial extraction enterprise. The French established trading posts along the St. Lawrence River. The English established the Hudson's Bay Company in 1670, a commercial entity so powerful that at its peak it controlled nearly a tenth of the Earth's land surface. Indigenous trappers, with their millennia of knowledge about the land and the animals, did most of the actual hunting. Europeans provided trade goods, metal tools, cloth, firearms, alcohol. This is the fork in the road. This is the moment where Canada's demographic future diverged so sharply from what was happening to the south that the effects are still visible today. In Virginia, in Massachusetts, in Pennsylvania, the English colonists came to farm. They came with families, with livestock, and with seeds. They cleared land. They built permanent settlements. They established institutions. They brought women. And because they brought women, they built communities that reproduced. In New France, in the territories controlled by the Hudson's Bay Company, the Europeans came to trade. Many of them came alone or with small groups of other men. Their goal was not to build a civilization, but to extract a commodity and ship it home. When the beavers in one area were depleted, they moved to the next watershed. By 1700, the English colonies to the south had a European population of somewhere around 250,000 people. New France, all of it, the entire territory from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River, had maybe 15,000 European settlers. 15,000. In a territory larger than all of Western Europe. This is not a small difference. This is a fundamentally different relationship with the land. The English colonists were building a country. The French were running a very large company store. Now, some people will argue, correctly, that this ignores the enormous role of indigenous peoples, both as participants in the fur trade and as people who were being systematically displaced and devastated by European diseases. That's true, and it's important. But for the purposes of understanding why Canada ended up with such a small population relative to its size, the fur trade mentality is crucial because it established a precedent. Canada as a place to take things from, not a place to build things in, that would echo through every subsequent era of Canadian history. When France and Britain went to war in the 1750s, the 7 Years' War, the first truly global conflict, Canada was one of the prizes. British forces under General Wolfe defeated French forces under Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham outside Quebec City in 1759, and in 1763, the Treaty of Paris handed New France to Britain. The British looked at Canada and faced a question that every subsequent Canadian government would also face. What do you do with a country this big, this cold, and this difficult to fill? They tried land grants. They encouraged loyalists, Americans who had remained loyal to the Crown during the Revolution and were now unwelcome in the new United States, to move north. Tens of thousands did, settling in what is now Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and southern Ontario. This was the first significant wave of English-speaking settlement in Canada, and it gave the country something it had lacked, a population with genuine agricultural intent. But it wasn't enough. and the fundamental problems of the land hadn't changed. Fast forward to the mid-1800s, Canada, or what would become Canada, is dealing with a specific and urgent crisis. The western prairies are empty, not metaphorically empty, genuinely, almost completely empty of European settlement. The Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta of today, approximately 1.9 million square kilometers of relatively flat, relatively fertile land, had essentially no permanent settler population. Indigenous nations, the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Plains Cree, the Assiniboine, the Sioux, had lived on this land for thousands of years, but European settlers, almost none. The Canadian government, newly formed in 1867 through Confederation, had a problem. The Americans were expanding westward with extraordinary speed and energy. The Transcontinental Railroad was being built. Settlers were flooding into the Great Plains by the millions. If Canada didn't populate its western territories soon, there was a genuine risk that American settlers, or worse, the American government itself, might simply occupy them. So the Canadians did something remarkable. They tried to give the land away. The Dominion Lands Act of 1872 offered any eligible settler, which meant in practice any white male over 21 years old, though the rules were modified over time, 160 acres of prairie land for free. 160 acres, a quarter section, free. All you had to do was break 30 acres of soil, build a habitable dwelling, and live on the land for 3 years. It was, on paper, one of the most generous land offers in human history, and nobody wanted it. Well, that's not quite right. People came, eventually, but the uptake was so slow, so frustrating to the government, that it triggered decades of aggressive immigration recruitment in Europe. Canadian agents fanned out across Germany, Ukraine, Scandinavia, Britain, actively trying to sell people on the idea of moving to the Canadian prairies. Let me describe what those early settlers actually faced. Not the marketing brochure version, the real version. Imagine you are a Ukrainian farmer. The year is 1897. You have heard, through a network of agents and community newspapers, that there is free land in Canada. You sell everything you own. You spend weeks on a crowded steamship crossing the Atlantic. You arrive in Halifax and take a train west, a journey of several more days, until you step off in some small station in what is now Saskatchewan. Around you is nothing. No trees, no buildings, nothing but grass extending to every horizon, trembling in a wind that has been blowing unobstructed from the Rockies for 1,000 miles. The sky is enormous. The silence is almost painful after the crowds and noise of Europe. You have been given your quarter section, a patch of land on a map. You walk to it. You find nothing there except more grass and sky. Winter is coming. You need to build shelter before it arrives. But there are no trees. The prairie has no wood. So you cut rectangles of sod from the earth, thick grass-matted blocks, and you stack them like bricks to build a shelter. A sod house, 3 feet of earthen wall. A grass roof, no windows, or windows made of oiled paper if you're lucky. In winter, with temperatures dropping to -40, you will spend months in a structure that is essentially a hole in the ground. Then, you need to break the soil. Prairie sod that has been building for 10,000 years is essentially a mat of root systems reaching deep into the earth. It breaks plow blades. It has defeated teams of horses. It requires specialized breaking plows and days of brutally hard labor for each acre. The nearest market for your wheat might be 100 miles away. The nearest doctor might be farther. And then comes your first winter. There are accounts from that era, diaries, letters sent home to family in Ukraine, in Germany, in Sweden, that describe what it was like. The blizzards that could erupt in minutes. While dropping visibility to zero and temperatures so fast that cattle froze standing in the fields. The isolation, the absolute, profound, crushing isolation of spending months in a sod hut with your family, seeing no other human beings, hearing only the wind. The scurvy from a diet of almost nothing but grain and salt meat. The grief of watching children sicken and die from diphtheria, from typhoid, from simple exposure, knowing that help was too far away and too expensive to reach. Many left. Many died. The ones who stayed, and some did, extraordinary, stubborn, resilient people who simply refused to give up, built what eventually became Canada's prairie provinces. But it was brutally hard, and the population density was always lower than the government had hoped. Because you cannot put 50 people on land that can sustainably support 5. The economics of prairie farming demanded space, large farms, small populations, enormous distances between communities. Then came the tool that was supposed to change everything. The Canadian Pacific Railway, completed in 1885 after an almost unimaginably difficult construction process, through the Canadian Shield, over the Rockies, across the prairie. The CPR was sold to the Canadian public as the solution to the population problem. A coast-to-coast railroad would make the West accessible. It would allow settlers to travel cheaply from eastern Canada. It would let prairie farmers ship their wheat to ports on both coasts. It would unite the country. It would fill the West. It helped. The railroad was genuinely important. But it was not the miracle it was promised to be, because the railroad also revealed something nobody in Ottawa had wanted to confront: the sheer scale of the problem. When the railroad was built, the distance from eastern Canada to British Columbia was finally measurable in days rather than months. But it was still enormous. The costs of building anything, any infrastructure at all, across that distance were staggering. And the population that would need to use and justify that infrastructure was still tiny. This is a dynamic that would haunt Canada for the next 140 years. And it's connected to something deeper. Something that shaped not just Canada's population, but its entire character as a nation. A pattern of decisions made in distant capitals by people who fundamentally misunderstood the land they were managing. A pattern of ambition outrunning reality, of government promises that couldn't survive contact with the actual Canadian North. Meanwhile, something was happening that deserves much more attention than it usually gets. While Ottawa was struggling to fill the prairies, the most talented, ambitious Canadians were leaving. The brain drain, the great exodus south. The defining demographic tragedy that Canada has never fully resolved. It started almost as soon as Canada became a country. By the 1880s, the movement was already significant enough to alarm Canadian politicians and newspapers. Young Canadians, educated, skilled, entrepreneurial, were moving to the United States in large numbers. The American economy was booming. American wages were higher. American cities were bigger, more dynamic, more full of opportunity. A Canadian engineer could earn 30% more in Boston than in Toronto. A Canadian doctor could build a more lucrative practice in New York than in Montreal. A Canadian inventor could find more capital and more customers in Chicago than in any Canadian city. The math was straightforward, and generations of Canadians did it. Between 1880 and 1920, an estimated 1 million Canadians emigrated to the United States. In a country whose total population during that period ranged from about 5 to 8 million, 1 million people leaving is catastrophic. It's the equivalent of the United States losing 40 million people today. And it kept happening through the Depression, when American cities were also depressed, but still offered more opportunity than Canada's resource-dependent hinterland. Through the post-war boom, when American prosperity created a gravitational pull that Canadian wages couldn't match, through the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s, when Canadians who wanted careers in technology, finance, entertainment, or medicine increasingly found that the United States was where those careers flourished. The names are almost too famous to recite, but recite them we must because they illuminate the point. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, was Canadian. He moved to the United States. James Naismith, who invented basketball, was Canadian. He moved to the United States. The insulin researchers Frederick Banting and Charles Best made their discovery in Canada, but the laboratory support and funding they needed to develop it required American resources. Mike Myers, Jim Carrey, Celine Dion. Elon Musk was not Canadian. But he's the heir to a tradition of genius, leaving Canada for larger stages. This isn't a criticism. These individuals made rational choices. But those rational choices, multiplied across millions of people over more than a century, had a profound structural effect on Canada's population and its economy. You lose your best people. The people who might have built the companies, founded the institutions, driven the economic growth that would have made Canada more attractive for the next generation. And the cycle feeds on itself. Now let's add one more layer to this historical picture, because the fur trade mentality didn't end with the beavers. It just changed commodities. After fur came timber. Vast swaths of Canada's forests were harvested, often clear-cut, and the timber shipped to Britain and later the United States. The workers were often temporary. The profits often flowed elsewhere. The forests were not replaced quickly enough. Communities built on logging boomed when the timber was thick and collapsed when it was gone. After timber came minerals. Gold in the Yukon. The Klondike Gold Rush of 1898 was one of the last great gold rushes in North American history, drawing 100,000 people north in a stampede of hope and greed, most of them left within a year or two. The Yukon's population today, 125 years later, is around 45,000 people, less than many American suburbs. After minerals came oil. The Alberta oil sands, one of the largest hydrocarbon deposits on Earth, generated enormous wealth. Fort McMurray became Canada's boom town. Workers flocked in from across Canada, drawn by wages that dwarfed anything available elsewhere. And the pattern repeated: not a city built for permanence, but a camp built for extraction. People came for the money, lived in man camps, essentially dormitories for workers, and left when the contract ended or the prices fell. The fur trade mentality. Come, take, leave. Build nothing permanent. Invest nothing in the land. The geography as a store to be emptied rather than a home to be made. This is what Canada's history taught itself, and it's been teaching that lesson ever since. But the lessons of geography and history aren't the whole story, because something changed in the 20th century that should have, by all rights, solved Canada's population problem: immigration. And the way Canada managed immigration is itself a fascinating, troubling, complicated story that takes us right to the heart of why Canada is still empty today. I want you to meet David Thompson. Thompson was born in London in 1770, came to Canada as a teenager to work for the Hudson's Bay Company, and over the course of his long life became one of the greatest land surveyors in human history. He mapped nearly 4 million square kilometers of North America. He was the first European to travel the full length of the Columbia River. His maps were so accurate that they were still being used by the Canadian government a century after his death. Thompson spent years in the Canadian interior, the boreal forest, the Rockies, the prairies. He lived among Indigenous peoples, married a Métis woman, learned Indigenous languages, and developed a deep understanding of the land that few Europeans of his era could match. And here is what Thompson wrote in his journals about the Canadian interior. We may here see the hand of Providence in the barren and inhospitable countries of the North. For if these countries produced the necessaries of life in abundance, the human race would here multiply beyond all bounds, and by degrees the forests would be destroyed. Think about that sentence. David Thompson, one of the most knowledgeable Europeans ever to travel the Canadian North, saw its emptiness not as a failure, but as providential, as designed, as right. He was wrong about Providence, almost certainly, but he was right about the design. The Canadian North was built by forces that predate human existence, and that don't particularly care about human ambition. The emptiness is not an accident. It's the outcome of a very specific set of geological, climatic, and ecological conditions that have been in place for millions of years. Now, let me tell you about the homesteaders who actually tried to change that. In the 1890s and early 1900s, a man named Clifford Sifton was Canada's Minister of the Interior. Sifton was the architect of Canada's most aggressive immigration and Western settlement campaign. He believed, with the evangelical fervor of a true believer, that the Canadian prairies could be filled with settlers if you just found the right settlers and recruited them aggressively enough. His most famous statement about immigrants has become notorious. He described his ideal settler as a stalwart peasant in a sheepskin coat, born on the soil, whose forefathers have been farmers for 10 generations. By this, he meant Eastern Europeans, Ukrainians especially, but also Poles, Galicians, Czechs, Slovaks, people accustomed to hard agricultural labor in difficult conditions, people who wouldn't be deterred by a sod house and a prairie blizzard. Sifton's agents traveled through Eastern Europe, posting advertisements, holding meetings, handing out pamphlets that described the Canadian prairies in terms that stretched the truth considerably. The last best west, the pamphlets called it. Rich soil, healthy climate, free homesteads. They came by the hundreds of thousands. Between 1896 and 1914, roughly 3 million immigrants arrived in Canada, the largest immigration wave in Canadian history relative to the existing population. And many of them did go to the prairies. They built communities. They learned to grow wheat in conditions that would have defeated their parents. They created prairie towns with Ukrainian Orthodox churches and Scandinavian Lutheran churches and German Catholic churches that still stand today. But something crucial happened that Sifton and the Canadian government hadn't adequately planned for. Not enough of them stayed. Some left because the winters were worse than advertised. Some left because the market for wheat collapsed and the economics of prairie farming didn't pencil out. Some left because they couldn't maintain the social and cultural connections they needed to survive psychologically in such isolation. Some left because they got sick, and the nearest doctor was too far away. Some left because they watched their children sicken and die, and they simply couldn't bear to stay. The prairie settlement story is often told as a triumph, and in many ways it is. The tenacity of those settlers, the Ukrainians, the Germans, the Scandinavians, the Americans, the Mennonites, the Hutterites, is genuinely extraordinary. They built something from almost nothing, but the population density they achieved, the number of people the prairies actually ended up supporting, was always lower than the government's projections, because the projections were based on optimism, not ecology. They were based on what politicians wanted the land to be, not what the land actually was. The prairies could support agriculture. They proved that. But they could not support the dense agricultural civilization that had grown up in Iowa or Illinois or Indiana, where the soil was better, the growing season was longer, the rainfall was more reliable, and the distance to markets was shorter. Canada got the farms, but not the farmers, not in the numbers anyone had hoped for. And then, to make things worse, came the Depression. The Dirty 30s hit the Canadian prairies harder than almost anywhere else in North America. Drought combined with the global economic collapse to produce conditions of genuine desperation. The soil that prairie farmers had so laboriously broken and cultivated, that thin, somewhat fragile prairie topsoil that wasn't quite as deep or as rich as the American soil further south, blew away, literally blew away. Dust storms swept across Saskatchewan and Alberta, turning the sky dark at noon, burying fences, suffocating livestock. Communities that had barely gotten established were abandoned almost overnight. The population of Prairie Saskatchewan fell by a third between 1931 and 1941. People just left. They couldn't survive, and many of them went to British Columbia, to Ontario, to the United States. They did not come back. The Dirty 30s accelerated a pattern that was already underway: the consolidation of Canada's population into urban centers. The farms that had required a family on every quarter section were increasingly mechanized, allowing one farm operator with modern equipment to cultivate thousands of acres. The rural communities that had served those farms, the small towns every 20 miles along the railway lines, each with its grain elevator and general store and church, began their long decline. Drive across Saskatchewan today, and you will see the evidence everywhere. Abandoned farmhouses, their windows broken, slowly returning to the prairie grass. Empty streets in towns that once had thriving main streets. Grain elevators that have been demolished, leaving only concrete foundations and the memory of communities that once gathered around them. The settlement of the Canadian prairies was one of the great human stories of the late 19th and early 20th century. But it ended not with a city, not with a thriving rural civilization, but with something more complex. A landscape marked by the ambition of people who came, worked themselves half to death, and then gradually, generation by generation, left. Because the land could support farming, but it couldn't support the life that most people, given a choice, wanted to live. For most of Canada's history as a nation, its immigration policy was, to put it plainly, racist. Not in a subtle dog whistle way, explicitly, legislatively, unapologetically racist. The Chinese Immigration Act of 1885 imposed a head tax, initially $50, later raised to $500, on every Chinese person who entered Canada. $500 was roughly 2 years' wages for a Chinese laborer. The message was unambiguous. You are welcome to build our railroad, but you are not welcome to stay and become Canadian. The Continuous Journey Regulation of 1908 effectively barred immigration from India by requiring that immigrants arrive on a continuous voyage from their country of origin. A journey that was physically impossible to arrange. When the Komagata Maru arrived in Vancouver in 1914, carrying 376 passengers from India, the ship was kept in the harbor for 2 months and then turned away. Most of the passengers were killed after being returned to British India and classified as revolutionaries. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1923 banned almost all Chinese immigration entirely. It remained in effect until 1947. These were not fringe policies. They were mainstream legislation, debated and passed in Parliament, cheered by newspapers, supported by labor unions that feared competition for jobs. The consequence was that during the late 19th and early 20th century, the period when Canada's population could have grown most aggressively through immigration, it was deliberately restricting the pool of potential immigrants to white Europeans. And even within that pool, some groups were more welcome than others. The British were most welcome, then Western Europeans, then Eastern Europeans, who were tolerated rather than celebrated. Southern and Eastern Europeans faced discrimination. Anyone from Asia, Africa, or the Caribbean faced legal exclusion. This is not just a moral failure, though it is profoundly that. It's also a demographic failure. Canada chose, through explicit policy, to remain smaller than it needed to be. It turned away millions of people who wanted to come. People who would have worked, built businesses, raised families, paid taxes, filled the prairies, staffed the hospitals, built the cities. The reckoning came slowly. After World War II, the moral framework for racial exclusion in immigration had been destroyed. It's difficult to justify racial discrimination after a war fought explicitly against Nazism. The 1947 Canadian Citizenship Act granted Chinese Canadians and South Asian Canadians the right to vote for the first time. The most explicit race-based exclusions were gradually dismantled through the 1950s, but the real transformation came in 1967. Under Prime Minister Lester Pearson and then Pierre Trudeau, Canada overhauled its immigration system with what became known as the points system. Instead of selecting immigrants based on their national origin or ethnicity, Canada would evaluate them based on education, work experience, language skills, and other objective factors. Anyone from any country who scored enough points could apply to immigrate. It was, by any measure, one of the most consequential policy decisions in Canadian history. Almost immediately, the demographics of Canadian immigration shifted dramatically. Where immigration had previously been dominated by Europeans, it now became genuinely global. Immigrants arrived from India, from China, from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from the Caribbean, from East Africa, from Latin America. Cities like Toronto and Vancouver transformed within a generation from fairly homogeneous Anglo-European cities into some of the most ethnically diverse places on the planet. Today, Toronto is often cited as the most ethnically diverse city in the world, more so than London or New York, with more than half of its population born outside Canada. Every major city in Canada has communities from dozens of countries. The food alone is staggering in its variety. Walk through Vancouver, and within a few blocks, you can find authentic Vietnamese piado, Ethiopian injera, Filipino adobo, Afghan bolani. This is real. This is meaningful. This transformation is one of the things Canadians are genuinely, justifiably proud of. But here's the thing about the points system and the immigration boom that followed it. It didn't spread Canada's population out. It concentrated it further. The immigrants who came through the points system were educated, skilled, often professionals. And like all educated professionals everywhere, they wanted to live in places with strong labor markets, good schools, diverse communities, cultural amenities. In Canada, that meant Toronto, or Vancouver, or Montreal. Not Fort McMurray, not Moncton, not Saskatoon, not Whitehorse. The government tried. They created regional immigration programs to encourage newcomers to settle in smaller cities and rural areas. They offered visa pathways tied to specific provinces and regions. But the gravitational pull of the three major cities was irresistible. Most immigrants stayed where the opportunities were. Within a few years of arriving in a smaller city, many had relocated to Toronto or Vancouver anyway. The result? The big cities got bigger. The rest of Canada got older and slowly emptier. And then, the big cities started to break. Let's talk about what happened to housing in Canada's major cities, because it is one of the most dramatic economic stories in North American history. And it's directly connected to the question of why Canada's population remains relatively small, even in an era of high immigration. In 1981, the average house price in Toronto was about $90,000. Adjusted for inflation to today's dollars, that's roughly $300,000. Expensive, but manageable. A two-income professional household could realistically save a down payment and buy a home within a few years of working. By 2005, average Toronto home prices had reached about $335,000. Still challenging, but not impossible. By 2010, $430,000. By 2015, $630,000. By 2020, $930,000. By early 2022, at the peak of the post-pandemic surge, over $1.3 million. $1.3 million for an average house in a city where the median household income is around $85,000. To buy the average Toronto home, a household earning the median income would need to spend more than 15 times their annual earnings. The traditional rule of thumb for housing affordability is 3 to 4 times annual income. Canada's largest city is at 15. Vancouver, during the same period, hit similar peaks. Average home prices that required 16, 17, 18 times median income. This is not a housing market. This is a crisis, and it has direct consequences for population. Young Canadians, people in their 20s and 30s, the demographic most likely to form families and have children, are being priced out of the cities where they work. The choice many face is stark. Spend 50, 60, 70% of your take-home pay on rent or mortgage payments in a major city, or leave. Many are leaving. Not just to smaller Canadian cities, to the United States. The brain drain that defined the late 19th and early 20th century never really stopped. It just took a break during the post-war boom and then resumed. And in the current era of extreme housing costs and a Canadian dollar that consistently underperforms the American dollar, the calculations have become brutal. A software engineer who can earn 120,000 Canadian dollars in Toronto can earn 200,000 American dollars in Seattle or San Francisco. After accounting for the exchange rate, that's nearly a 3-to-1 income advantage, and that person in Seattle can afford to buy a house in a reasonable neighborhood. In Toronto, 200,000 Canadian dollars doesn't even get you a down payment. The numbers don't lie. And thousands of Canadians are doing this math and reaching the same conclusion every year. There's a phrase that circulates in Canadian professional networks, said with a kind of exhausted humor. The American dream is now the Canadian dream, said by Canadians who've already made the move south and are doing very, very well. But the housing crisis is only one part of the modern story. There's another dimension that's equally important and far less discussed: the infrastructure impossibility. Canada has a fundamental mathematical problem. The cost of infrastructure, roads, bridges, power lines, water systems, internet, is relatively fixed per unit of distance. Whether you're building a highway through a dense suburb or through empty boreal forest, the cost per kilometer is roughly similar. The difference is how many people that infrastructure serves. In a dense urban area, you might build a road that serves 50,000 people per kilometer. The cost per person is low enough to be economically justifiable. In the Canadian North, you might build a road that serves 2 people per kilometer, or 0. The cost per person is staggering, so staggering that it almost never happens, which is why so many northern communities have no roads, which is why they're accessible only by air, or in winter by ice roads. which is why living in northern Canada costs so much more than living in southern Canada, which is why people don't move there. This is the vicious cycle at the heart of Canada's population geography. No people means no infrastructure. No infrastructure means no people. Economists have a term for this: the infrastructure trap. And Canada has been trapped in it for 150 years. The Canadian government has known about this problem for decades. It has tried various solutions: northern allowances, tax incentives for workers in remote areas, subsidized housing programs, resource revenue sharing agreements. None of it has worked well enough to fundamentally shift the pattern. Because here's the thing, the government cannot change human nature. People want to live where there are other people. They want schools for their children, hospitals when they're sick, stores where they can buy groceries without paying $15 for a head of lettuce. They want social connections, cultural experiences, the ability to date someone, make friends, join a community. These are not luxuries. They are fundamental human needs, and Northern Canada cannot provide them. Not at scale. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Now let's look at the other side of the immigration equation, because Canada's immigration story in the modern era isn't just about who comes in. It's also about what happens after they arrive. Canada brings in approximately 400,000 to 500,000 immigrants per year, one of the highest rates in the world relative to population size. By 2050, the government has projected that essentially all of Canada's population growth will come from immigration, because the domestic birth rate, currently about 1.47 children per woman, is well below the 2.1 needed for replacement-level fertility. Immigration is not optional for Canada's demographic future. Without it, Canada's population would begin to shrink. But the immigration system has produced some deeply uncomfortable paradoxes. A paradox 1. Canada's immigration system selects for education and skill. It attracts some of the most talented people in the world. And then, with remarkable consistency, it fails to properly integrate those people into the workforce. A study by Statistics Canada found that in the early 2000s, immigrants with university degrees earned roughly 48 cents for every dollar earned by Canadian-born workers with equivalent qualifications. Almost half. The reasons are various. Foreign credentials not recognized by Canadian professional associations, lack of Canadian work experience required by employers, language barriers even among people who speak English or French fluently. A doctor from India becomes a taxi driver in Toronto. An engineer from Nigeria becomes a warehouse worker in Calgary. A professor from China becomes a restaurant worker in Vancouver. Canada attracted their talent and then wasted it. This is not just a personal tragedy for the individuals involved, though it is profoundly that. It's an economic catastrophe for the country. Paradox 2. Canada's immigration boom has made housing unaffordable, which makes Canada less attractive as an immigrant destination, which undermines the immigration system designed to sustain Canada's population. When you bring in 400,000 people per year, and you're not building nearly enough housing to accommodate them, prices go up, rents go up, vacancy rates collapse. New immigrants arrive expecting a path to stability, and instead find themselves spending half their income on a shared basement apartment. Some are discovering, to their shock, that the Canada they were sold in the brochures is not the Canada that exists in Toronto or Vancouver in the mid-2020s. In 2023 and 2024, something remarkable happened. Statistics began showing net emigration, more people leaving Canada than arriving, at least among certain demographic groups. The number of non-permanent residents choosing to leave Canada rather than apply for permanent status began to rise. Canada's reputation as an immigrant-friendly success story was showing cracks. Paradox 3. The very success of Canada's multicultural immigration model has created a kind of self-reinforcing concentration. When a large Filipino community exists in a specific neighborhood of Toronto, the next wave of Filipino immigrants wants to move to that neighborhood. When a strong Punjabi community exists in a suburb of Vancouver, the next wave of Punjabi immigrants wants to be near that community. This is human nature, and it's entirely understandable. But it means that the ethnic communities that give Canadian cities their extraordinary diversity are also anchors that keep new immigrants from spreading out to smaller cities and rural areas. The government has tried to address this through the Rural and Northern Immigration Pilot Program and similar initiatives, offering residency pathways specifically to people who agree to settle outside the major cities. The results have been mixed. People arrive in Sudbury or Moncton or Prince George, fulfill their residency requirements, and then not infrequently relocate to Toronto or Vancouver within a few years, because Toronto and Vancouver are where the communities are, and communities are where life is. Now, let's talk about something that rarely appears in the polite conversation about Canada's demographic challenges, but that looms over everything: the situation of Indigenous peoples. About 5% of Canada's population, roughly 2 million people, identify as First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. Many live in remote communities that are among the most economically distressed places in the developed world. Communities without clean drinking water, an emergency that has persisted in some places for decades, generating international condemnation. Communities where housing is so overcrowded that multiple families share spaces designed for one. Communities where youth suicide rates are among the highest on Earth. This is not a historical accident. It's the direct result of deliberate policy choices made over 150 years. The forced removal of children from their families to residential schools designed to eradicate Indigenous language and culture. The pass system that restricted Indigenous movement. The land dispossession that stripped communities of the economic resources that would have allowed them to build prosperous societies. The residential school system, which operated from the 1870s until the 1990s, with the last school closing in 1996, was perhaps the most traumatic. More than 150,000 Indigenous children were removed from their families and sent to institutions where they were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their cultures, or maintain connections to their communities. Abuse was widespread. Children died. The unmarked graves being found at former residential school sites across Canada, more than 1,000 confirmed or suspected so far, with thousands more expected, are a wound in the national consciousness that has not healed and may not heal for generations. The consequences for population are real. Indigenous communities that had survived for thousands of years in conditions that challenged European settlers, that had developed the deep ecological knowledge of how to live sustainably on this land, have been systematically undermined. The population health indicators, the economic statistics, the social outcomes for many indigenous communities reflect not inherent disadvantage, but a century and a half of deliberate harm. If Canada is going to address its population geography, if it's going to find ways to make northern and remote Canada more livable and economically viable, it cannot do so without confronting this history and working genuinely in partnership with Indigenous nations, not as an afterthought, not as a checkbox, as a fundamental requirement, because Indigenous people hold knowledge about this land that no government database captures. They know which rivers run which way and why. They know which plants survive which winters. They know the patterns of animal migration that haven't changed in 10,000 years. They know how to live here, and they deserve, finally, to be heard. The modern crisis isn't just about housing and immigration and infrastructure. It's about who Canada has been and who it's deciding to become. And that question hangs in the air over every statistical table and every policy debate, which brings us to the future and to the wild card that changes everything. There's a conversation that happens every year in universities across Canada that captures the brain drain in real time. A graduating class of engineers, computer science students, medical students, finance graduates. They're talented. They've been educated at institutions that rank among the best in the world. The University of Toronto consistently appears in global top 20 rankings. They've invested years and often substantial debt into their credentials. And then they sit down and do the math. A software engineer graduating from the University of Waterloo, one of the top computer science programs in North America, regularly rated by Google, Apple, Amazon, and every major tech company faces a choice: stay in Canada and work at a Canadian tech company for $90,000 to $120,000 Canadian dollars per year, or accept one of the American offers that are already in their inbox before graduation for $180,000 to $250,000 American dollars per year in Seattle or San Francisco or Austin. At current exchange rates, that American salary is worth 250 to 350% of the Canadian equivalent. And it comes with the ability to actually buy a house in a reasonable time frame, in a city where the housing market, while expensive, hasn't completely decoupled from economic reality. The math is not subtle, and tens of thousands of Canadian graduates do it every year. The irony is exquisite and painful. Was Canada built world-class universities partly to produce the skilled workers that would make the Canadian economy competitive? And the Canadian economy, by failing to offer comparable wages or affordable housing, exports those workers to the United States before the graduation gown is back in the rental closet. This is the brain drain in the 21st century. It's not dramatic. It's not a crisis moment. It's a quiet, continuous, devastating hemorrhage of talent. Now let me tell you about the city that represents the absolute peak of Canada's modern contradictions. Vancouver. Vancouver sits in a narrow strip of land between the Pacific Ocean and the coast mountains of British Columbia. It has one of the mildest climates in Canada. Not warm, exactly, but rarely very cold. With cherry blossoms in February and relatively mild winters that feel almost absurd compared to the rest of the country. The natural setting is breathtaking. Snow-capped mountains, ocean, forests, a working harbor full of tankers and cargo ships and seaplanes. By almost any measure of livability, climate, nature, safety, cultural amenities, ethnic diversity, air quality, Vancouver is one of the most desirable cities in the world, and it's been priced beyond the reach of almost anyone who actually grew up there. The housing dynamics in Vancouver are particularly well studied because they're particularly extreme. A combination of factors, geography. The city is literally hemmed in by mountains and ocean and can't expand in most directions. Foreign investment, particularly from Chinese nationals who purchased Vancouver real estate as a safe haven investment, speculation, municipal zoning laws that prevented densification for decades, and simple supply restriction drove prices into a completely different economic reality than local wages could support. By 2016, the average house price in Greater Vancouver was over $1 million. By 2022, it was pushing $1.3 million. The ratio of house prices to median household income reached levels not seen in any other major North American city, and among the highest ever recorded anywhere in the developed world. What this meant in practice: a native Vancouverite who grew up in a single-family home in the suburbs, whose parents bought that home for $200,000 in 1990, watched that same house become worth $2 million while their salary as a teacher, nurse, or firefighter stagnated at levels that made the home completely unaffordable. The inherited wealth was there, but only if your parents owned. If they rented, or if you were a first-generation immigrant who arrived after the boom, you were locked out. The social consequences have been significant. Teachers who can't afford to live in the city where they work. Nurses commuting 2 hours each way. Essential service workers driving from the suburbs or leaving Vancouver entirely. The character of the city, its diversity, its vibrancy, the mix of economic backgrounds that made neighborhoods interesting, began to hollow out as anyone without inherited equity was priced out. And this dynamic, high immigration, high demand, restricted supply, spiraling prices spread outward from Vancouver and Toronto to smaller cities that had previously been affordable: Victoria, Kelowna, Hamilton, Kitchener-Waterloo, Barrie. City after city found its housing market transformed by demand from people priced out of the major centers, driving up prices for people who had moved there specifically to escape the major centers' costs. Canada's population concentrated, and the concentration made the concentrated places less livable, and the places that weren't concentrated stayed empty. The vicious cycle runs everywhere. Now, let me tell you about a different kind of emptiness, one that doesn't show up on population density maps, but is equally real. The emptiness of the communities that are slowly disappearing. In Atlantic Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, and Newfoundland and Labrador, There are hundreds of small towns and villages that have been losing population for decades. Not catastrophically, not all at once, but steadily, year after year, like a slow leak. The pattern is always the same. The fishery, or the mine, or the mill that sustained the community for generations becomes less economically viable through depletion of the resource, or automation, or competition from elsewhere. Young people leave to find work in Halifax, or Toronto, or Fort McMurray. The population ages. The school closes because there aren't enough children to justify it. The hospital reduces services because there aren't enough patients. The closure of services accelerates the departure of the remaining young families who need those services. The remaining population grows older and fewer. Eventually, the community reaches what demographers call a death spiral, a point where the population is so reduced and so aged that a natural decline alone will eliminate it within a generation or two, even without any further outmigration. In Newfoundland alone, there are communities that have been resettled, a term for the formal abandonment of a community where the government offers financial incentives for residents to move elsewhere. Dozens of times over the past 70 years, entire outport communities on remote coastlines and islands, once home to generations of fishing families, now empty. The houses stand vacant, the stages where fish were dried still jutting into the harbor. The graves in the churchyard are the only evidence that people were here. This is not a third world phenomenon. This is happening in a G7 country with a GDP per capita that ranks among the highest in the world. It's happening because the economics of resource extraction, which created these communities in the first place, have changed. And because the geography makes it genuinely impossible to support these communities once the resource that sustained them is gone. Canada's emptiness is not just in the north. It's spreading, creeping south, filling in the spaces left by communities that simply can no longer sustain themselves. And the response of the federal and provincial governments has been to be charitable, inadequate. Economic development programs that fund conferences about economic development rather than actual economic development. Infrastructure investments that come too late after the young people have already left. Immigration programs designed to bring newcomers to struggling communities where the newcomers arrive, complete their residency requirements, and leave for Toronto as soon as they're eligible. The political economy of Canada makes it very difficult to invest adequately in declining regions. Politicians represent constituencies. Declining regions have fewer voters. Fewer voters means less political leverage. Less political leverage means less investment. Less investment means further decline. The math is brutal, and it runs in only one direction. This is the modern face of Canada's demographic challenge, not the dramatic emptiness of the Arctic, which has always been empty and will likely remain so, but the slow, quiet, heartbreaking emptiness of the communities that used to be full, that people built and loved and raised children in, that are now disappearing before our eyes. That's the emptiness that should haunt Canada's policymakers, and mostly doesn't. In 2023, scientists measuring the sea ice extent in the Arctic recorded the second lowest summer minimum in recorded history. The Northwest Passage, the route through Canada's Arctic archipelago that John Cabot died searching for, that Henry Hudson's crew mutinied over, that generations of explorers froze and starved and went mad looking for, was navigable. Not just theoretically navigable, practically navigable. Cargo ships, research vessels, cruise ships transited the passage. Waters that had been locked in ice year-round for as long as human memory extended were now open for months at a time. This is the climate change paradox that sits at the heart of Canada's future. Climate change is the worst thing that has happened to the Earth in human history. The disruption to ecosystems, to weather patterns, to sea levels, to agricultural systems around the world, the suffering it is causing and will cause, measured in human lives, in food insecurity, in displacement, in extinction of species, is catastrophic. Full stop. And yet, for Canada specifically, in specific and limited ways, it presents something else entirely. The permafrost, the permanently frozen ground that underlies nearly half of Canada's land area, is thawing. This is releasing massive amounts of methane and carbon dioxide, accelerating global warming further. But it's also, in some areas, revealing land that was previously unusable. Ground that was too frozen to build on, too frozen to farm, too frozen to support permanent human habitation, is becoming, in some places, in some seasons, less frozen. The boreal forest's northern edge is moving north. Trees are establishing themselves in what was recently tundra. Growing seasons in some northern communities are lengthening by days every decade. The Northwest Passage is opening. This has enormous economic implications. A shipping route through Canada's Arctic connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans would dramatically reduce transit times between Asia and Europe. It would make northern Canada strategically important in a way it has never been before. It would create economic pressure to develop the North, to build ports, airstrips, communities, supply chains. And Canada has another card to play that may prove to be the most important of the 21st century. Fresh water. Canada holds approximately 20% of the world's total freshwater supply. 20%. In the Great Lakes alone, there is enough fresh water to cover the entire continental United States to a depth of roughly 9 feet. The Mackenzie River system in Canada's north carries more fresh water than any river in North America except the Mississippi. As climate change progresses, water scarcity is becoming one of the defining crises of the century. Parts of the American West are running out of water. The Colorado River, which supplies water to 7 American states and Mexico, no longer reliably reaches the sea. Aquifers beneath the Great Plains that took millions of years to fill are being depleted in decades. India, China, North Africa, the Middle East, billions of people in regions facing severe water stress. Canada, meanwhile, has more fresh water than almost anywhere else on Earth. This could make Canada not just a climate refuge, but a geopolitical necessity. A country that other nations depend on. A country whose emptiness becomes a strategic asset rather than a demographic failure. But, and this is the crucial qualification, none of this changes the underlying geography automatically. The permafrost thawing does not instantly create farmable soil. The Northwest Passage opening does not instantly create the port infrastructure needed to use it. The freshwater abundance does not automatically translate into water that can be efficiently delivered to people who need it. These are opportunities, not solutions. And there's a darker version of the climate change story that deserves attention. As the permafrost thaws, buildings and infrastructure built on frozen ground begin to sink and crack. Roads buckle. Foundations shift. Entire communities built on the assumption of permanent frozen ground are now watching that assumption dissolve. In parts of the Northwest Territories, houses are visibly tilting. In Nunavut, airports are requiring constant maintenance as runways warp. The very communities that climate change might theoretically make more accessible are being simultaneously undermined by it. Wildfire. The boreal forest, as it warms, is burning at rates that have broken historical records in the 2000s and 2000s. In 2023, Canada experienced the worst wildfire season in its recorded history, with approximately 18 million hectares burning, an area larger than all of Germany. The fires generated smoke plumes that turned the skies of New York City and Chicago orange. A surreal reminder that Canada's wilderness is not so remote as it might seem. The communities built on resource extraction in northern Canada, mining towns, logging towns, oil sands developments, are increasingly vulnerable to the disruptions that climate change brings. The promise of the North as a new frontier for settlement runs headlong into the reality of a North that is becoming more volatile, more unpredictable, and in some ways more dangerous than before. So where does this leave us? Let's return to the question we opened with. Not just why Canada is empty. We've answered that thoroughly now, across 12,000 years of geological and human history. But the deeper question underneath it: is Canada's emptiness a problem? Here's the honest answer. It depends entirely on what you value. And the answer is not the same for everyone. If you value economic power and geopolitical influence, if you believe Canada should be a global force proportional to its landmass, then yes, Canada's small population is a serious problem. With 40 million people, Canada's GDP is roughly $2 trillion. The United States, with 8 times the population, has a GDP of roughly $27 trillion. Canada punches above its weight on a per capita basis, but its total economic weight is modest. In global diplomacy, in military capacity, in cultural influence, Canada is a middle power in a world increasingly shaped by giants. If you value quality of life, the ability to live in a clean, safe, uncrowded country with access to nature and social services, Canada's small population is not obviously a problem. Canadians routinely rank among the most satisfied people in the world. Life expectancy is high, crime rates are relatively low, the natural environment is extraordinary, and the space, the sheer, overwhelming, humbling space, gives Canada something that no amount of GDP can buy. If you are a young Canadian trying to buy a house in Toronto or Vancouver, if you are watching the door to home ownership close permanently in front of you because of market forces entirely beyond your control, Canada's population and economic model feel like a system that has failed you personally. If you are an Indigenous person in a remote northern community without clean water, with inadequate housing, watching your language disappear and your young people leave, Canada's emptiness looks completely different than it does from a downtown condo. The Canada question does not have a single answer. It has 40 million answers, multiplied by every generation that has lived here and will live here. But here's what I think the evidence demands we acknowledge. Canada is not empty because it failed. Canada is not empty because its people lacked ambition or its government lacked vision. Canada is empty because the land itself, shaped by ice ages, carved by glaciers, starved of soil, shortened in its growing seasons, made immense and difficult and beautiful by forces that predate human existence by billions of years, has always set hard limits on how many people can live here and where. The fur traders understood this intuitively, even if they expressed it in the language of commercial exploitation. The indigenous nations understood it profoundly, encoding it in thousands of years of ecological knowledge. The settlers on the prairies learned it the hard way, in sod houses in blizzards, counting frost-free days with the desperation of people who need the math to work. Canada is not America. It never was. It was always going to be different, smaller in population, larger in land, more resource-dependent, more geographically concentrated, more isolated in its wild places. And perhaps that difference, rather than a deficit to be corrected, is actually the defining feature of what Canada is. There is one more thing I want to say before we close this out, and it's the thing that I think gets lost most often in debates about Canada's population, Canada's immigration, Canada's economic development. The emptiness is real, not as an absence, as a presence. The boreal forest at dawn, when the loons begin calling across a lake so still it reflects the sky perfectly, and you can't tell where the water ends and the air begins. The Arctic at midnight in summer, the sun still hovering above the horizon, casting long golden shadows across tundra that stretches forever. The Rockies in October, the first snow on the peaks above the tree line, the aspen leaves turn to gold in the valleys below. The prairie at harvest time, the combine working long rows of wheat under a sky so enormous it makes you feel both tiny and connected to something much larger than yourself. These places are real. They exist. They are part of a country that 40 million people call home. And they exist, in large part, because 40 million is not 400 million. Because the land was never cleared, never drained, never paved, never subdivided. Because the geology said no, and the climate said no, and the economics said no, and in saying no, they preserved something that most of the rest of the developed world has lost. The emptiness of Canada is one of the last great wilderness areas on Earth. It is habitat for species that are functionally extinct elsewhere. It is watershed for rivers that run clean in a world of polluted water. It is silence in a world that has forgotten what silence sounds like. Is that worth something? I think it's worth almost everything. But here's the question I'm going to leave you with. Not the question of whether Canada should grow its population. It probably should, carefully, thoughtfully, in ways that address the housing crisis and the infrastructure gap and the deep injustices done to Indigenous peoples. The question is this: what is the point of a country? Is it to maximize population, to maximize GDP, to maximize military power and geopolitical influence? Or is it to give the people who live there the best possible life and maybe, in doing so, to preserve something for the people who will live there 1,000 years from now. Canada has never fully answered this question. It keeps trying to be something it can't quite be, as populous as America, as economically dominant, as globally influential, while also being something no other country on Earth can replicate. Vast, largely wild, inhabited at the edges by a small population that has figured out, mostly, how to get along. Maybe the right answer is to stop treating the emptiness as a problem to be solved. Maybe it's the point. Maybe it always was. If this video made you see Canada differently, not as a half-empty country, but as a fully inhabited question, a place that is still figuring out what it means to exist, then share it with someone who needs to think about it too. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on the questions that maps don't answer. And leave a comment with the one thing from this video that genuinely surprised you. Because this story isn't over. Canada's future is being written right now in the decisions being made in Ottawa and in provincial capitals and in every house hunting session and immigration application and community meeting about a pipeline or a mine or a solar farm in a place most people have never heard of. The land is still here, waiting. The question is, who shows up to meet it, and what they decide to do. Let me tell you about a place called Yellowknife. Yellowknife is the capital of the Northwest Territories. It sits on the north shore of Great Slave Lake, one of the deepest lakes on Earth, about 400 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle. Population, roughly 20,000 people. 20,000 people running the capital city of a territory larger than France, Germany, and the United Kingdom combined. In summer, Yellowknife is genuinely beautiful. The lake is enormous and crystalline. The long days give everything a golden quality that lasts from late afternoon until nearly midnight. The boreal forest surrounds the city. There are canoe routes accessible by road that will take you into wilderness you might not see another human being in for weeks. In winter, Yellowknife is something else entirely. Temperatures regularly fall to -40 degrees Celsius. The aurora borealis dances nightly overhead in colors: green, purple, white, occasionally red, that seem to have come from another world. The Great Slave Lake freezes so solidly that ice roads are built across it, connecting communities that have no other land access. And the cost of living. A 2-bedroom apartment in Yellowknife costs more to rent than a comparable apartment in Vancouver, Canada's most expensive city. Groceries run 50 to 100% more than in southern Canadian cities. A simple restaurant meal can cost what a nice dinner would run in Manhattan. Why? Because everything has to be brought in, by air in summer, by ice road and barge in winter. The logistics of supplying a community of 20,000 people in the subarctic are enormously expensive. And those costs are passed directly to consumers. This is the economics of northern habitation, and it illustrates why climate change, for all its genuine terror, is a complicated variable in Canada's future. As temperatures warm, the cost of living in northern communities might fall. Transportation might become cheaper and more reliable as weather patterns shift. Growing seasons might lengthen, but that warming also brings permafrost thaw, which destabilizes everything built on frozen ground. It brings more extreme weather events, including, paradoxically, more intense blizzards in some regions as warming increases atmospheric moisture. It brings wildfire risk that is already transforming the boreal landscape at rates that alarm ecologists. The communities of northern Canada are caught in this paradox. They may become more livable in some respects as the climate warms, and simultaneously more dangerous and less stable in others. What's clear is that northern Canada's future will not be written by southern politicians sitting in Ottawa, making projections on spreadsheets. It will be written by the communities, and particularly the Indigenous communities who actually live there, who know this land in ways that no satellite image or climate model fully captures. And this brings me to the thing I want to say most clearly before we close. Canada's relationship with its own emptiness has always been a relationship with the people who were already there. With the nations, hundreds of them, each with their own language, their own governance, their own deep knowledge of their specific place in this land, that have called Canada home for at least 12,000 years. The story of why Canada is empty is also, inescapably, the story of what was done to make it empty. The policies of dispossession, the residential schools, the pass system, the Indian Act, the 60s scoop, the specific, systematic, deliberate effort to strip Indigenous peoples of the land, the language, the children, and the authority that would have allowed them to maintain thriving communities in places that Europeans found too difficult to settle. Canada didn't fail to populate more north. Canada depopulated the north and then declared it empty. That distinction matters enormously. Because when we ask, how do we develop the north, or how do we populate remote Canada, we are asking questions that have very different answers, depending on whether you start with the recognition that the land is already occupied, already known, already loved, or whether you start with the colonial assumption that emptiness equals opportunity. The truth about Canada's emptiness is not a simple story of geology and climate and economic miscalculation. It is a story of choices, the choices made by governments, by corporations, by settlers, by ordinary people doing the math on their own best interests that accumulated over centuries into the demographic reality we see today. Some of those choices were forced by nature. The Laurentide ice sheet was not a policy decision. The thin acidic soils of the Canadian Shield are not the government's fault. The short growing seasons of the subarctic are not a historical injustice, but many of them were not forced by nature at all. The racist immigration policies that kept Canada's population smaller than it needed to be. The fur trade mentality that treated Canada as a warehouse to be emptied rather than a home to be built. The failures of infrastructure investment in remote regions. The inadequate support for Indigenous communities. The housing policies that created crisis in the cities while remote areas emptied. The brain drain that continues today, subsidized by public universities and accelerated by a housing market that has made the cities where good jobs exist functionally unaffordable for young people. These were choices, and choices can be made differently. The question of Canada's future isn't really a demographic question. It's a question of values, of what kind of country Canada wants to be, of whose knowledge is respected in the decisions that shape the land, of what is worth preserving and what is worth changing. Is the emptiness a failure, an accident, a crime, a gift? It's all four, simultaneously. Canada is the second largest country on Earth. It has fewer people than California. 90% of its population lives in a thin strip near the American border. The North is vast and wild and mostly empty of permanent human habitation. And it always will be, to a large degree. The geology won't change. The growing seasons won't lengthen dramatically enough to transform the North into farmland. The infrastructure costs won't fall low enough to make building in the boreal economically rational for most purposes. But within those constraints, within the very real limits set by 12,000 years of geology and climate, there is still an enormous amount of room for Canada to become more than it is. More just, more inclusive, more connected, more willing to look at the parts of itself it has chosen to ignore and ask what it would mean to take them seriously. The land is not empty because Canada failed. The land is not empty because Canadians lack ambition. The land is not empty because the cold is too cold or the north is too far. The land is mostly empty because it is genuinely, profoundly, geologically difficult to live there. And because over 2 centuries, the choices made by people and governments consistently took the path of least resistance, which meant staying south, staying near the border, staying near the familiar. The question for the next century is whether Canada will make different choices, whether it will invest in its remote communities rather than letting them die, whether it will settle its land claims with Indigenous nations and support the governance structures that could make northern communities thrive, whether it will fix its housing markets and keep its young people, whether it will build the infrastructure that would allow people to live in more of this country's extraordinary, challenging, beautiful land. None of that will happen because a YouTube video said it should. But it might happen if enough people understand what Canada is, what it has been, and what it could become. 40 million people, 10 million square kilometers. The ratio doesn't have to stay the same forever, but changing it will require more than ambition. It will require honesty about the history, about the land, about who has always been here and who has always known it best. That's where the story ends. That's also where it begins.